we're starting on production before the design is finished, and that's causing issues. We're making these things much more complex than they need to be. We're designing things that maybe didn't need to be redesigned in the first place. We're designing things that maybe we don't have a lot of experience designing. And sort of, we're end up in this situation where, you start the design, you start building it, and you have to rework the design, and you have to sort of, change a ship as it's being built, which sort of drives up these drives up costs, drives out delivery dates. And sort of that seems like a sort of repeated factor at work in these programs to me.
Hello, everyone. This is Admiral James Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. Thank you to Dataminr for sponsoring Season 4 of Maritime Nation. We're honored today to be joined by Brian Potter. Brian is a senior infrastructure fellow at the Institute for Progress, or IFP, and author of the Construction Physics newsletter on Substack. Brian writes about the technology and economics of building construction with a focus on improving productivity and reducing costs. He previously managed an engineering team at Katerra, a SoftBank-backed construction startup, and has 15 years of experience as a structural engineer, which helps him diagnose why productivity in the construction industry has been falling over the last 50 years. And that's a real problem for our country. Brian has a bachelor's in civil engineering from Georgia Tech and a master's in systems engineering from the University of Central Florida. Brian, welcome to Maritime Nation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's dive right in, Brian, and let's start broadly. So during the Second World War, the U.S. built warships and support ships at an astonishing pace. Frankly, in Arthur Herman's book, Freedom's Forge, he articulates the atrophy of our maritime industrial base from 55 shipyards, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, just at the end of World War II, to 19 shipyards during the Reagan-Weinberger era of the 1980s and the 600-ship Navy, to just 7 today. And I just want to ask you, so what's changed between then and now that prevents that kind of industrial mobilization today?
Yeah, so during World War II, as I'm sure you know, the U.S. built just an enormous quantity of ships, most of which, they built huge amounts of, military vessels and combat vessels, but most of which were just simple cargo ships, thousands and thousands of these relatively simple cargo ships that they produced in just huge quantities. During the war, the U.S. was responsible for something like 90% of the shipbuilding over in the entire world, just because it produced, just enormous amounts of ships. But what's interesting is if you look before World War II, the U.S. actually was a very small builder of ships. It was not a commercially competitive, shipbuilder internationally, in a similar situation as we were today. And it built a pretty small number of ships prior to the war. So the sort of arc of U.S. shipbuilding since roughly the Civil War has been just declining commercial competitiveness. And then you see a huge spike during wartime emergencies. So you saw one during World War II, obviously, and then you saw a little bit of a smaller spike, but still a pretty substantial one during World War I. Where the issue with those ships is that they built huge numbers of them, but the war ended before they could arrive. So we ended up having flooded the market with all these cargo ships at the end of the war. But the sort of the main difference that I see is just the exigencies of war and just the emergency situation of mobilization and, this urgency to build just huge numbers of ships all at once has really been one of the few things that you see is able to sort of shake the U.S. industry out of its traditional ways of operating and be able to build just huge things, huge numbers of ships in huge quantities. And sort of other than that, the main difference is just, the second half of the 20th century is just you see it be more difficult to build all sorts of things. We have, labor costs have risen over time. You have more regulation, more sort of just bureaucracy and administration. Everything is a much more difficult process. So you see this across the board. Skyscrapers are built more slowly and more expensively. Everything is just takes more time and effort to build today than it did, in sort of the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, thanks for that. And to your point, World War One, but more so in World War Two, we probably would not have prevailed. We would have prevailed eventually, but not as quickly in that conflict without the Liberty ships that carried, the beans and the bullets and the troops to the fight. And we lost a lot of them too in both the first
Mhm.
battle and the second battle of the Atlantic. And that was unrestricted submarine warfare by the German submarine force. And we're going to see a similar problem if we get into a conflict out in the Western Pacific with shipping trying to get to where the troops are in these remote island chains or where the naval infrastructure is located to protect and project power.
Yeah, something interesting that you with the Liberty ships as you talked about is that early on in the war, Germany was not very worried about the US shipbuilding because like, well, we have all these submarines. We're just going to sink their ships. Who cares how many they build? We're just going to sink all these ships. And they did sink, as you say, huge numbers of these ships. But the miracle of U.S. Liberty ship production was that they just built the ships faster that they could be sunk. They didn't have any amazing strategy other than we're just going to build these things in such enormous quantities that we will build them faster than they can be sunk. And so you see these graphs of like, losses, but then, overall ships just rising faster than the losses. And we're just able to overwhelm them just with just huge numbers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's it's World War One time frame, but there's a book out called Jellicoe's War about Admiral Lord Jellicoe in the First World War. It's written by his grandson on his delay in executing convoy operations of merchant ships, which eventually frustrated the German submarine force until we could get to the point where they could be attrited, and we overwhelmed them with the supply chain to Europe. Same thing in World War II, except some technological advancements there with ASDIC, with sonar, hedgehogs, better torpedoes, radar to detect surface boat. U-boats spend most of their time on the surface. They dive to attack. And then convoy operations too, a la that great movie with Tom Hanks called Greyhound. So thanks for that. A lot of this and where we are in the atrophy in our industrial base is discussed in our new book here, Returning from Ebb Tide, which we'll get you a copy of, Brian.
Oh,
It's
that'd be
been out.
great.
Yeah, it's been out for about a month, and it's optimistic. That's why returning from ebb tide, we need a flood tide of the same kind of production that we had in the Second World War, of not just Liberty ships, but warships to sustain the fight and be able to project power so we can deter conflict. Because we know that there is this looming window of 2027. What's going to happen in 2027? Some call it the Davidson window after my friend Phil Davidson, who mentioned it in the retirement speech from Indo-PACOM, that China was going to do something in the Taiwan Straits by that time frame. But I'm not sure that people are really aware. The average citizen is really aware of how serious that threat is. And you talked about the exigencies of war. I love that term. Do you think the exigencies of a looming war, particularly in the Western Pacific with the pacing threat, are there today? Or are we just immune to that here in American society?
It's a good question, and I'll speak from what I my speculation, but of course I'm not an expert on this sort of thing. Um, I hope that in a real urgent, wartime situation, we would be willing to, you know, clear away a lot of this cruft that makes it too hard to sort of build things quickly and rapidly. I worry we have lost some of the sort of muscle memory that's needed to do that sort of thing. I think, very early on during COVID-19, you saw a lot of sort of optimism that, oh, we're going to sort of this is a major emergency. We are going to sort of put together the industrial infrastructure that we need to start building the supplies. We need medical supplies and masks and other sorts of things like that. And we really didn't end up doing that. We ended up just kind of muddled through. We didn't end up building a lot of this manufacturing structure. There's a few places we did it. We ended up bringing vaccine manufacturing online very, very quickly. But in general, we didn't see like a sort of emergency mobilization in that situation. You see something I can kind of similar with Ukraine, where again, I'm not an expert, but it's my sense that it's taken us a very, very long time to sort of scale up our sort of artillery ammunition manufacturing capabilities, and we have sort of scaled those up, but it's taken quite a bit of time. And so I hope that we are able to do it, but recent sort of events have made me a little bit cautious about that.
Yeah, some great points there, and I think you're right. There was uh, a lingering kind of delay in the response to COVID-19. Part of it was shock. I mean, we lost a million
Mm,
people in this country, but getting to mass production of masks, of test kits, of gloves that could support the hospitals. But I'm with you on the vaccine. I mean, that was literally a massive effort with both American ingenuity, research development, and foreign scientists who were in this country that brought the vaccine to fruition and saved a lot of lives. And so that kind of effort is going to be necessary if we ever do have a conflict out in the Western Pacific. And the time to be worrying about that is now, not when it happens. That's too late.
for sure.
So, what do you think the key physical bottlenecks in U.S. shipyards are today? Is it dry dock capacity? Is it the ability of cranes or crane size? Is it inefficiency in throughput? And how do all these constraints impact both naval and the commercial side that we talk about in returning from ebb tide and the timelines affiliated with, a Liberty ship-like construction effort?
So my sense, when looking at this, I was actually on Google Maps earlier today, scoping out shipyards from a satellite view. But my sense is that U.S., there's sort of a question of just quantity. U.S. just has a very like small number of shipyards. You mentioned earlier, U.S. has something like seven major shipyards. And
Yeah.
a lot of those are not like, very large, high output shipyards, right? If you look at like the very largest shipyard, it's an even smaller number, maybe just like one or two. But in somewhere a place like China, they have maybe, 100, 200 very large shipyards and hundreds more smaller ones. Places like Korea, which do a lot of shipbuilding, they will maybe a smaller number, but their shipyards will be even more enormous, just these huge sprawling facilities. So it's a small number. A lot of times the US shipyards are old. They have been, built back in sort of the early 20th century, maybe. And a lot of them are not designed for like sh modern shipbuilding methods. They don't not, arranged so you can have like this, your large block construction and process lanes where everything moves through in a really efficient fashion. They're often sort of constrained in whether they can expand their area or not. Something that you saw historically with these like major shipbuilding company or countries is that they sort of built these new greenfield shipyards that were very large and had areas to expand. And so they could, have the space to put, blocks in process of being built and stuff like that. Where a lot of the U.S. yards are much, much more constrained. China, I think, has been able to sort of a lot of their shipyards when they started constrained, they would just move the entire shipyard to somewhere else where it had more space. There's an island off the coast of Shanghai, which I'm not going to try to pronounce the name because I will butcher it, but they've moved a lot of their shipbuilding infrastructure there and just turned this island into just this huge shipbuilding base. So those are a lot of the reasons. And dry dock capacity, I'm not quite sure about crane capacity. If you kind of look, a lot of these U.S. yards have many fewer cranes and what looks like much lower capacity cranes. You see many more like large, heavy, gantry cranes on in foreign large yards than you do in the U.S. one. I read an article the other day that I thought was interesting. It was talking about a very large block lift at a U.S. shipyard. I don't remember which one. It was like, 1,000 ton of block that was being lifted by multiple cranes, which wouldn't be like that's a pretty large block. It's not outside the realm of like normal operations, I would say, for normal shipyards. And it's not also uncommon to have to move large blocks like that with multiple cranes. But what struck me from the article was that the U.S. yards had to rent the cranes to lift this block because they didn't have them already installed and in use in normal operations. This was a special thing they had to bring in special equipment for. So I think that kind of gives a little bit of an illustration as to sort of the state of the U.S. yards, where something like that would be done just in the course of normal operations at like a large foreign shipyard.
Yeah, and I can relate to what you just said about the Chinese and the enormous shipbuilding capacity they have. I mean, Shanghai shipyard, the footprint is just enormous. And the other bad news for us is they have room to expand
Mhm.
in that shipyard, as you said, moving to the island offshore. On the crane issue, yeah, sad commentary on having to rent the cranes to do the heavy lift. And, a lot of cranes in this country, particularly in the port of LA, are Chinese cranes. And so we have to deal with that as well. So we aren't manufacturing the kinds of things that can help us with productivity and efficiency in our own yards. Let me shift gears here and talk about something that's near and dear to our heart at the Navy League and that we support, the Jones Act. So it's a 1920 legislative act, and you and I have talked about this prior to the podcast, that was originated by Senator Wesley Jones from the state of Washington State to ensure a vibrant U.S. shipbuilding industry. And if Senator Jones was around today, obviously he's passed away, I don't think he'd be happy. The three legs of the stool of the Jones Act are uh, in support of U.S. shipping to take goods and services between the continental United States and U.S. ports of call, for example, our territory in Puerto Rico or in Hawaii. And these ships must be U.S. built predominantly. There's percentages there. U.S. built, U.S. owned, U.S. crewed. And, I'm all in favor of that. It preserves not just the sovereignty of these routes that are going from CONUS to these two locations, but it also preserves the sovereignty of our inland and intercoastal waterways. I don't think we want foreign ships running up and down the Mississippi, so we do that ourselves. It's kept the barge, tugs, and cargo industry and the intercoastal in business with a robust maritime industrial base. There's a lot of money tied up there. It's very lucrative, and the Jones Act is primarily, in my view, intended to maintain a wartime reserve of ships to sustain a war effort and get the ammo and the troops and the logistics and sustainment support to the fight. It's turned out to be good for the small platforms and things I talked about in the intercoastal. It falls short on the large carriers. So I'd like to get your opinion. How do you see it? And is there ways that we could have perhaps improve our ability to get these large carriers under U.S. flags to places where we're going to need the support?
Sure. So yeah, I will say that as you obviously know, the Jones Act is somewhat controversial because many of people, as you think that this is necessary to maintain the shipbuilding base that we're going to need in emergencies. The other side of the coin is that people think that this drives up the cost of U.S. built ships because they're insulated from sort of any sort of foreign competition. And so you things like, what that ends up cashing out to is that a lot of maritime services that, rely on these Jones Act built ships. So like trade from, continental US to Hawaii or Puerto Rico, and then other things like installing offshore wind turbines or like dredging, which rely on these US built ships. These end up being much more expensive than they would be if you were able to use foreign built ships. And that sort of drives up the cost of these services. And in some cases, we don't get enough of the services that maybe we otherwise would like to have done. Um, my opinion, and so this act is controversial. People often blame the Jones Act for like all U.S. shipbuilding woes more as generally. They think that, oh, this, act is protectionist. These shipbuilders don't need to get their act together. And so all our ships and shipbuilding is just not as good as it otherwise be. I do not think that that is the case. I think the causes of, the fact that U.S. ocean-going ships are sort of non-competitive commercially, it far predates the Jones Act. You basically see U.S. commercial shipbuilding not be competitive since roughly the Civil War, and the Jones Act kind of just, reinforces a situation that I think would exist otherwise. And I think it's obviously definitely true that the Jones Act does help maintain this sort of shipbuilding industrial base that would not exist outside of these protections. You kind of see that, I believe, in the 1980s, where that's when the construction differential subsidies, which were passed in the 1930s to sort of compensate U.S. people buying U.S. ships to basically make up the difference between the cost of U.S. built ships and ships built in foreign yards. And this was another sort of measure to try to support the U.S. shipbuilding industry. And those were in place from the 30s till roughly the 80s, and they were eliminated in the 80s. And once these were eliminated, you basically see the number of commercial ships built in U.S. yards immediately declines very substantially. And, again, if you're relying on, if you don't think the US should be having to pay for those things, maybe you think that's good. If you think that we should be sort of willing to sort of pony up the money to maintain the industrial base to build these things, build these ships in emergencies, maybe you think that that is not so good. So I think it is, again, it's what do you think is more important? Do you think it's more important to sort of maintain this manufacturing and capability? Do you think it's more important to sort of get these services more inexpensively? I do not have a sort of firm opinion on that part, but I do think it's sort of overrated as a cause of the shipbuilding industry's ills.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And, our major point here, me being a former operator and a warfighter is in our book, Ebb-Tide, Vice Admiral D. Mewborn, who's a friend, he ran Military SEAL of Command. And before he retired, he was the deputy commander of Transcom, the big airlift, sea lift, global combatant command that takes stuff all over the world. You got, 110,000 people out of Afghanistan in a month during the unfortunate debacle of the withdrawal in the last administration.
Mhm.
If you go back to the Gulf War, D's statistics that he cites in the book are impressive. Transcom moved more than 313 million pounds of equipment to Ukraine in 2022. And further back in Operation Desert Storm, Desert Shield, it moved 286,000 passengers, both military and civilian, 1.2 million short tons of cargo to the theater, 91% of which traveled by sea. And my fear is that, if we had to do that again in 2025, we wouldn't be able to lift as much stuff because we've allowed the atrophy of our commercial force, whether it be MARAD or Military SEAL of Command. So I'm with you. I think there's some unfair sniping at the Jones Act. And I do agree with you, too. It was Reagan era where some of these support fees for commercial shipbuilding were done away with in the spirit of competition, and eventually that became part of globalization. And with the arrival of the Ships Act, our friend Senator Kelly and former Senator Rubio, Congressman Garamendi, Congressman Walz, there's an effort there to get us back up on the production step, build 250 commercial platforms, provide some benefits and some bonuses for U.S. shipbuilders to do that, to have U.S. flagged ships, to get discounts for utilization of our ports and our port facilities, to support, modernize, and upgun the merchant marine academies, both Kings Point and the state maritime academies, which produce all of our commercial mariners and officers that are out there. So there's an effort underway to return from ebb tide with a flood tide of programs and resources that will help us do what we need to do as a nation. And so I hope that the Ships Act will take root quickly and do away with some of these problems. Uh, Let me shift gears into allied and partner shipbuilders, and let's talk about Japan and South Korea. So both Japan and South Korea have been leaders in commercial shipbuilding, and Hanwha, which is a South Korean company, recently acquired the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. That yard was producing battleships and carriers and probably Liberty ships at the rate of, one a week during World War II. Uh, my team at CMS has been up to that yard. We've seen the new construction of the national security multi-mission vessel. Typically, a contract for MARAD for 5 ships. They're coming in on time and pretty much on budget. And they're beautiful ships. They're going off to our Merchant Marine Academy state and national and providing a training platform, which is multi-mission and, could be used in time of war. I think they're actually great ships and we could adapt them to be tenders or command ships or hospital ships. And so if you look at, and that's a small, low numbers example of what we can do. If you look at what Japan and South Korea are doing, they're producing large numbers of ships in a very short period of time. It only takes them about a year and a half to build a frigate. We have struggled with a Constellation class frigate for a number of reasons. It was a perfect design to begin with, but we didn't build that design. We changed it, 85% of it. So what structural or policy factors enables the dominance of the Japanese, the South Koreans? I mean, the Chinese have 5,600 Chinese flagged commercial ships on the open oceans. It's over 50%. Next in line, Japan and South Korea. The U.S., we're down in the numbers about 1%. So, what's the difference between post-World War II, Cold War globalization in Japan and South Korea as opposed to here? Is it labor? Is it supply chain? Is it just erstwhile desire to maintain an industrial base? Is it the size of the country? Is it the threat? They're closer to the threat. What do you think?
Yeah, so Japan is really interesting because after World War II, they were sort of, completely destroyed basically. And they decided it was, a shipbuilding industry was sort of an important industry that they wanted to support, that they wanted to build up. And so there was a number of government policy in place, policies in place to do that. There was something that they had called the Program Shipbuilding Scheme, where the government would just say, "Hey, we are going to tell you the number, tell the shipyards here. Here's what the ships that you're going to build. Here's what you're going to order. The government is going to buy them or finance their construction, and then turn around and then resell them to people who would ship owners." And that in the very early stages of the rebuilding of the industry, that was very important for a number of years. It was like the main source of, new ship purchases for a number of years. It's very important. But also the Japanese were just very eager to sort of make their industry very, very strong. It was very important to them that they had a very strong shipbuilding industry, and whether that's because they're an island nation, they're very reliant on trade. It's hard to say, but they did a lot. They were very dedicated to sort of developing and improving their industry. And so the Japanese developed because they actually took the Liberty ship production methods that were used during World War II, these sort of block construction methods that the US had basically invented. And they took those methods over, they were taken over to Japan by US shipbuilders who had sort of were interested in still building ships. They were looking around for places to sort of build ships in the post-war era. They went over to some of these Japanese shipyards, some of these naval shipyards, very large facilities that had been undamaged, and they went and started building these ships over there using these sort of new methods. And as the Japanese sort of developed these methods, this became the sort of modern method of building ships. They sort of block fabrication, group technology, process lane, process control, all those sorts of methods were sort of developed in Japan in the 1950s and 1960s. And now that's the standard of method of building ships. everywhere. And then sort of in the 1970s, 1980s, Korea basically decided, oh, we also want to have a shipbuilding industry. It's also very important to us. We want to sort of help our industry develop. And so they basically went and tried to learn those methods of shipbuilding from the people who had mastered them, from the Japanese, but also from people in the UK. But if you look at the arc of sort of the countries that have been able to sort of build up these shipbuilding industries, you kind of see a lot of similarities. One is kind of like you mentioned, you have this like very strong desire to make their industry successful and willingness to sort of, and not just like successful and just build ships, but very competitive. You know, we're gonna compete in the commercial market and be a winner and be successful producing our ships and selling them for, you know, a competitive price. Um, and so you see a very strong motivation in all these countries to try to do it. And one of those things is that they're willing to sort of just learn from the best people that already know how to sort of build these things and willing to invest a lot of time and effort into sort of making their industry successful. Because these development efforts, these are multi-decade efforts. Japan ended up becoming the biggest shipbuilder in the world in the 1950s, but this was after about, you know, 10 years of developing its industry. Korea, I think, took even longer. And China, which is, of course, have become the biggest commercial shipbuilder, that was like a 40-year effort, something like that. It was really in the 1980s, the very early 1980s, when they started wanting to make their industry very competitive. And it took a very, very long time for them to sort of build up the capabilities to do that. But then on top of that, you also have factors, you know, simple things like cheap inputs, cheap labor, and cheap steel have historically been very important. And these are the things that allow these sort of nascent shipbuilders to compete early on when they maybe don't have amazing shipbuilding capabilities. They tend to start with like pretty simple vessels and just take advantage of their low cost labor, low cost materials, and then they gradually expand their capabilities from there. You don't see quite as much success in building up a shipbuilding industry if you don't have that as a starting point, if you don't have cheap labor and cheap materials to sort of be able to help kickstart your industry.
Yeah, obviously our labor rates are higher. And you bring up a number of great points in there. Let me ask you, what do you think about the deal that the president struck between Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel? Is that going to help us out? I mean, the labor unions are pretty happy about it. It's a good deal for American workers. How about supply and cost?
It seems like a very good deal to me. It seems like it sends a strong signal that, you know, the Japanese are like they're interested in this industry. They think it's an industry worth supporting, and we get the benefit of like maintaining these facilities and maintaining the jobs that staff them, and while also having this like expertise that knows how to like operate these facilities like most efficiently to come in and help like run them, more successfully. So I think, yeah, the sort of steel, you know, Nippon Steel coming in buying U.S. Steel. I think, as you mentioned, the sort of Korean shipbuilders coming in and buying these shipyards. Those all seem just like pure win situations to me.
Yeah, you know, your other point that's really interesting here, which I think is lost on a lot of people because they want, you know how Americans are, we want instantaneous gratification, right? So the Japanese post-World War II, you know, country, I mean, two nuclear weapons used to end that war, industrial base, and the people are just worn down, tired of war, but they come back strong, to their great credit. And it takes them about a decade to build up a maritime industrial base that's going to produce ships and become, you know, a world-class shipbuilding organization, and then or nation. And then South Korea says, "Hey, we want some of that too." It takes them time to learn, you know, at least a decade, 20 years. You know, you talked about 50s to the end of the 50s for Japan, then the 70s, 80s, South Korea gets into the game. And China, you know, while we've been uh, putting our boots in the sand in the global war on terror, from 9/11 to the last administration, the end of our presence in Afghanistan, 20 years focused on that kind of fight, which is different than the kind of fight we're going to face out in the Pacific. China's been plodding along in this long-term strategic plan to do both one belt, one road, to have a commercial shipbuilding industry to support their nation, to have a conglomeration of five different services into the China Coast Guard, which creates a white shipping conglomerate that's very powerful. And in some cases, particularly in the hotspots in Philippine waters, the white shipping is just like a warship, the way they're treating our allies and partners down in Second Thomas Shoal. And then they just surpassed in China 400 warships to our 300. So, while we've been policing the world and doing other things, China's been slowly moving ahead, and now they outnumber us. I still think we can beat them in a fight, better capability, better sailors, better ships, but it is concerning. And we've got to do something about that. So again, back to the instant gratification. This is not going to be a overnight turnover in the maritime industrial base in this country. It's going to take time, and we've got to have patience, both strategic and tactical patience. You are listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with key experts and practitioners. This season is produced with support from Dataminr. Dataminr is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Dataminr solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients, including the Department of Defense, in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. Here at CMS, our whole team uses Dataminr's First Alert to stay up to date on breaking news or crises that impact our national security or the security of our allies and partners. Which brings me to my next question. If we pivot from commercial vessels to naval shipbuilding and warships, the U.S. Navy's acquisition model for how we build warships is known as design-build contracts that in the last couple of decades, we have transferred more risk to the shipyards. And, an example of that is something I mentioned earlier in the podcast, and that's the Constellation-class frigate. The Navy needs a frigate, a lighter, faster vessel, not a heavy destroyer to go off and do the kinds of things that we're doing in the Red Sea. Frigates would be perfectly capable of that anti-air warfare campaign against drones and ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. We don't have a frigate. We allowed the Oliver Hazard Perry class to decommission, and then it took us about 5 years to wake up and say, hey, we got to bring the frigate back. So we have a parent design from an Italian company, Fincantieri. It's established a base here in the United States in Marinette, Wisconsin on the Great Lakes. They are building the littoral combat ship class. That yard has been around since World War II, building ships, and it's been upgunned to build the frigate. But we took the European design for the frigate and we changed it. And I understand the reasons why we want to Americanize things and make it compatible with both our weapons and our IT and our sonars and radars and Aegis combat system and all that. But we took the parent design and changed almost 85% of it, which set the yard back on its heels. And they had to make all these changes, on the fly while we're in production. And that has put the frigate in a position where it's behind. Now, it's under review, and I hope that the Navy and the Secretary of the Navy make the decision to keep the frigate program alive. But in your opinion, does this design build work well, or do we need to make changes? How we do this?
So yeah, I'll start with saying that, this details of like naval acquisition and specific stuff like that is not my main area of expertise and focus. So I will do my best to muddle through with some response here. My background is in the construction industry, and it's interesting that construction also often gets criticized for the opposite sort of thing, where design build is a relatively uncommon way of building things in construction, building new buildings. You typically see a division between the designer of a building and people who put it up. And often you see people, will say, oh, if, we had this more collaboration between the designer and the builder. where the same person who would design it would build it, you would have a much more robust and more efficient design and building process. And then sort of to speak to the sort of design evolution to compare so what you talked about with the Constellation class frigate to the Liberty ship, which we talked about earlier. Liberty ship was also an updated sort of design that had been taken from a foreign builder. It was a UK design, and it was taken and they redesigned it to sort of be built in US shipyards. They had to sort of make a couple changes. They had to change it from riveted to welded because welded ships could be built much more quickly. They had to sort of recreate the drawings because American shipbuilders were used to having much more detail and much more explanation on their sets of drawings than the UK shipbuilders, which were had a little bit higher level of experience, a little bit higher level of craft. They could look at a sort of very vague design and figure it out, where the US shipbuilders needed something much more specific. So anyway, the point of all that is that it can make it of course can make sense to like take a design and then redesign it. But in something like that, they minimized the changes as much as possible because this was an existing design that had already worked well. They didn't want to like change it completely and change the whole lines and things like that. With regards to the weather design, you want something that's more an iterative or evolutionary process. Um, Um, or sort of, sorry, with regards to does the design build make more sense? I think it just kind of depends. It's hard to sort of blame something like that specifically on the production system at work and the production thing at play. In other industries, you can see design build kind of working well and having allowing for a sort of robust innovation, robust sort of investment in manufacturing and things like that. I will say that if you take away the risk of something of that the sort of design build would bring, and just if you're reducing risk more generally, you definitely will see more capital in investment and more building of facilities. This is something that you see and you saw historically in China, where we mentioned earlier that they have a very, very large number of shipyards. And part of that reason is because the Chinese really incentivized people to sort of build up these shipyards and create these facilities. There were very strong, incentives and to basically build these things up. And often historically, these shipbuilders were insulated from basically needing to sort of have these operations run efficiently. Oftentimes, shipyards were able to just sort of bid whatever they thought would take to win a commercial order, and then sort of Beijing, the Chinese government, would basically cover whatever the cost end up actually would be, which was often much, much higher than what they actually ended up charging to get the order. And they were just able to eat that cost as a way to sort of learn how to build ships more efficiently and be able to have the work to fill their shipyards. And so I think it's definitely the case that you would, see more capital investment if you were able to take some of the risk away from these yards, especially because shipbuilding is such a cyclical industry where it's very hard to sort of make these investments and be assured of the payoff of them. But I'm not sure how much the design build is specifically a contributor there.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And you mentioned a couple interesting things that come into play. Reducing risk, obviously, so we get more investors. And yeah, I'm with you. I mean, we did the research in the book. I mean, China heavily subsidizes their commercial and their military shipyards in order to get what they want. And the proof in the pudding is, 5,500 Chinese flagged vessels on the open ocean, and another 400 warships. So uh, they have invested smartly in order to do that, and they have an economy that can afford that. And we ought to think about that. There's some of that in the Ships Act for us, and I'm glad. This administration seems to be more interested than the last couple of administrations in shipbuilding. Part of it is to restore our industrial base. We talked about the Nippon Steel deal with U.S. Steel, but also to ensure that we can field a world-class Navy that's required by the Constitution. We maintain a Navy but we raise an army. And we've talked about on this podcast about that before. Let me shift into we talked design build. If we had a design that was complete at the start of construction, it would go better for us. But we noodle that design, and that is a problem. We also have a policy of clean sheet approaches to designing new vessels. So there's a program out there that's discussed the DDGX, the next generation destroyer. We've been really successful with the Arleigh Burke. We've modified it 3 times, Flight 1, Flight 2, Flight 3. We can build those ships pretty much on budget, on time. Got a couple of yards doing that. Bath Iron Works, and they've been built down in Pascagoula. And we're also discussing the SSNX, the next attack submarine beyond the Virginia class submarine. But we always start with this clean sheet approach, which, is a new design, new submarine, new class of ship. And we found in the past that, new classes of ships like the Ford class tend to have some growing pains. We put 23 different new technologies on the Ford. It's a magnificent warship. I mean, it has performed so well, and the deployments over the last couple of years in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Gulf. You can embark the F-35. It's bigger. It's got a bigger flight deck. The sail area is moved behind. It's got a new propulsion system, has fuel ports in places that are easier and ergonomically more available for the crew. The sortie generation time is faster than any other carrier out there. I could go on and on and on. So, we learned some lessons. EMALS, the electromagnetic assisted launch, and the elevators, we've fixed that problem, and they are working, and the ship is deploying and providing a return to the American taxpayer on its investment. But the clean sheet approach definitely compounds cost overruns due to immature production baselines. And you mentioned the Japanese having a block production approach. So I wonder what your thoughts are into adopting, some of that block production approach. I mean, do we always have to have a new hull? Do we always have to have a new production or a new propulsion system? The Aegis class combat system has proven itself again and again and again, and most recently in the Red Sea, knocking down all these Houthi missiles. And that upgrades to that system have been immediate. There's an engagement and there's a fix that goes into software or hardware for that system. So would an iterative design evolution be more practical? Now, I know you're not a guy who builds warships, but you're a guy who does. And you've studied this and you talked about Japan. What do you think?
Yeah, so there's, from what I can see, and again, as you say, not my expertise, not a warship builder. There's when you talking about like a new platform, right? There's kind of like a trade-off at work. So yeah, and on the one hand, it's less risky, it's cheaper, it's easier to do sort of an iterative design to sort of make changes over time. But then it's harder to make really substantial, really revolutionary changes to work those into a platform, to a product, to whatever it is you're building that has originally been designed for sort of something fundamentally different. And so kind of what you see, what in like shipbuilding, but also basically any sort of manufactured products, is you see sort of a combination approach where you come out with some, new kind of version of your widget or your ship or your car or whatever. Toyota comes out with a new model of car, Camry or whatever like that. And then you see as that sort of goes into production, you see gradually refinements over time. So the next year, the 2025 Camry will be a little bit different than the 24 Camry, right? It'll be the same basic platform, but it'll have sort of tweaks, things that they've improved, things that they've looked at, and things that they've figured out that they can do better or make cheaper or whatever. And as you kind of mentioned, that you see that with shipbuilding as well, where you mentioned there, like the Arleigh Burke went through several different versions. I think the Virginia class submarine they've gone through several iterations of that as they build it. But then eventually it comes to the point where either it's too difficult to sort of make these updates to a platform that is kind of aging, the technology has changed, the job that is trying to be doing has changed, and you get to the point where you want like a full clean sheet design that can sort of, take into account, the last however many years of technological improvement, or takes into account the fact that the jobs that we need to do are now different, is the fact that, so much more of warfare is probably going to be drone related, going to change the design requirements for some of these ships. I don't know, but that's sort of thing that somebody who does know would sort of need to figure out, and would inform whether you need sort of a new clean sheet design. So I think it's kind of just a fundamental trade-off in whatever it is you're building. There's kind of a slider there that do you emphasize sort of taking advantage of the new technology, and sort of rethink about what the jobs that you are that need to do, or do you sort of stick with your iterative approach? The technology maybe is fairly mature and hasn't advanced very much. We're still doing the same basic job. Maybe a more iterative approach makes sense. So, but I think that kind of trade-off exists kind of wherever you are, and whatever sort of thing that you're building it. And with what I can see, with a ship will go into production and it will go over several iterations and it'll be there for 30 years, something like that. It's not amazingly obvious that we don't have that slider in the right place for ships currently, but again, this is something that somebody who actually builds warships would be able to speak to much better.
No, but I think your point is well taken that there are trade-offs, right? And there are benefits to clean sheet versus iterative changes. Clearly, we've done that on the Arleigh Burke. Not a lot of room left for more changes, so I don't think we'll see a flight for Arleigh Burke. And it's probably time to go with a new design destroyer. The question of what will that destroyer look like and how much will it displace and how much will it cost will depend on what the needs of the Navy are and how Naval Sea Systems Command wants to work with competitors to design this thing. Same thing for the next generation attack submarine. So we're looking forward to seeing where this all plays out. One of the things about building a new ship that's a new design is that you attract good people, particularly those who are the engineers working in the shipyards or in Naval Sea Systems Command, because they want to work on something exciting. They don't want to do the same old thing over and over again, year in, year out. We've outsourced naval architects in the Navy, but there's a lot of pretty smart engineers that are working on these designs and these problems and getting ships in the water and underway. Okay. Last question. If you had to identify one systems level failure that explains America's lag in shipbuilding, whether it's commercial or military, is it misaligned incentives, lack of continuity in orders? We call that a steady demand signal. Regulatory burdens of requirements, underinvestment in physical capital, or something else?
So to start, I would kind of differentiate between, we talk about shipbuilding, but whether you're talking about commercial shipbuilding or naval shipbuilding, and I think the issues are a little bit different. I think for commercial, it's just fundamental, structural factors like very high labor costs, very high material costs. I was looking earlier this morning, and for most of the 20, for the first half of the, from 2000 to say 2010 or so, U.S. steel prices were actually pretty much in line with steel prices in the rest of the world. Over the last 10 years, they've really diverged, and now steel in the U.S. is something like 2 or 3 times the price of steel in somewhere like China, but even other countries as well. So if your steel is 3 times as expensive, if your labor is 5 times as expensive, that is just a fundamental economic barrier that's just going to make it impossible to make you compete, unsubsidized in shipbuilding. On top of the fact that you're, with ships, you're dealing things with like these are basically commodity things, right? They're not, in the commercial world, they're not, you're competing on just like basically price and delivery speed, and whoever can do that, whoever can build your ship the cheapest and the fastest is going to win. There's some areas of shipbuilding where that's not true, where it's like a very complex product where it's, higher up the value chain. Things like LNG carriers, things like icebreakers, which maybe I'll talk about here again a little bit more in a bit. But in general, you're talking about commodity products that, sort of the lowest cost operator is going to win. And it's just hard for a company or for a country with, structurally high cost of production to sort of overcome a barrier like that. With naval shipbuilding, this is fundamentally something that is going to be done in the U.S., but then maybe we're seeing our ships being more expensive and taking longer to deliver than we would like. I think the issues are a little bit different. And I think all the things that you mentioned are kind of important, and it's very hard to sort of trace out the causal factor as to which one is the most important or which one has influenced other things the most. It does seem like design issues are kind of a big, something that you see repeatedly is coming up in these programs where it's taken a very long time to design these things. We're starting on production before the design is finished, and that's causing issues. We're making these things much more complex than they need to be. We're designing things that maybe didn't need to be redesigned in the first place. We're designing things that maybe we don't have a lot of experience designing. And sort of, we're end up in this situation where, you start the design, you start building it, and you have to rework the design, and you have to sort of, change a ship as it's being built, which sort of drives up these drives up costs, drives out delivery dates. And sort of that seems like a sort of repeated factor at work in these programs to me. And as to why we have these design issues, that's a little bit harder for me to diagnose. I would say that kind of, as you mentioned, incentives seem like a big issue there, where there's sort of these programs, shipbuilders have incentives to sort of bid as low as they can to try to win the work because they think that once they win the work, the contract is not going away. And if they need to sort of raise their price or rework things later, it'll be easier to do that than to sort of bid what they think is accurate the first time. There's maybe incentives at work for sort of the powers that are acquiring these ships to pick whoever the lowest bidder is, even if they're maybe not necessarily the most qualified. I think you see something like this with the sort of polar security cutter icebreaker program that is currently just started construction, where a team was selected that I believe was the lowest bidder, but they selected the only team that did not partner with a foreign firm that had expertise in icebreaker construction. And as I mentioned, these icebreakers are like very specialized vessels that have very, special specific performance requirements. And they've just had a huge problem just getting through the design of these ships. They picked a sort of a parent design that wasn't really the right choice and spent all this time reworking it, similar to the Constellation class. Um, all the, costs have gone way up, delivery times have kind of gone way out, and it's just been kind of a little bit of a nightmare that you can kind of trace back to sort of, design issues that are perhaps the result of sort of incentive problems and how these programs get bid and get chosen.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we talked to the Coast Guard. We have friends over there. I want to see them to have a renewed icebreaker capability. You mentioned, Polar Star, that ship, which is our heavy icebreaker. There's another one like it that's used as a parts locker, but Polar Star is almost 50 years old. And, one of the only ships we have that can go down and brave the ice of Antarctica
Mhm.
does that in periodic deployments. And so that new national security polar cutter is absolutely essential for American projection of power, national security. And we have delayed the decision to get to the point where we're recapitalizing the polar security cutters in the Coast Guard's inventory. We should have made that decision probably a decade before we did, but we didn't. So now it is where it is. I'm looking forward to seeing the polar security cutter when it comes out. We had the medium icebreaker Healy caught fire last year, and we've had to lease a replacement to do some of the the less strenuous duties of an icebreaker. But meanwhile, the Russians have over 50 icebreakers, some of them nuclear powered, and the Chinese are about there too. And they both have designs on the Arctic. As we know, we're an Arctic nation, and we have one big heavy icebreaker. So we've got to fix that. The thing I liked about this discussion, Brian, is you know, uh, you've stated a couple of times you're not a shipbuilder, but sometimes it's nice to get an outside set of eyes looking in. Like a doctor who's a general practitioner who comes in and says, why are you doing this? Why are you taking this medicine? Or that doesn't make sense. And I think he brought up a lot of really interesting points as a senior infrastructure fellow in the Institute for Progress, and truly appreciate your time and your insights here today. And I hope that some of the things that you've mentioned we can inculcate into the flood tide in both our commercial industry and our warship industry in this country, and necessary for the Navy and necessary for our commercial industry as well. So, folks, that's a wrap. And thanks to Brian Potter for joining Maritime Nation. I'd like to thank all our listeners for joining us each month. And if you haven't heard our previous episode, you can always catch up on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all covered content described here today can be found on our new website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org. Thanks to Dataminr for the sponsorship and support. And thanks to our sound engineer, James Peterson. Stay tuned for the next episode of Maritime Nation.